Okay, let's come in. Now we're definitely in the home stretch, the true home stretch. So everyone come back inside. We have a closing keynote presentation from Rolf Lindemann of Knock Knock. After that, I'll have a panel discussion with Bob Lord, Pamela Dingle, and Christian Brand. And then I'll say some final comments, and we'll wrap up for the year. So Rolf, how you doing? Can you hear me? All right, we can't hear Rolf.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. So Rolf could not join us today. It had a physical mishap, but thanks for joining us live from Germany. We're going to turn things over to you now, Rolf.
Great, and thank you for having me. So good afternoon. Just 2 presentations away from the closing remarks. I think it's a good time to step back and reflect the state of identity and authentication, the way we have traveled so far, and also to paint a picture of its future, what I would call the ePromiseland. And when I joined FIDO, it was roughly 10 years ago, the world was completely different, right? Everything we are doing now and we take for granted now, I think was seen as science fiction by many people. But in fact, the concept of identity and authentication is not really new. Humans used jewelry 100,000 years ago and tattoos 3,000 years ago for that. But then it took us a few centuries to figure out how to make the world more practical. And if you look at those pictures like here, bank clerks would personally know most people and recognize customers. That was the early thing of authentication, how they would do authentication. And that was very convenient, a very convenient form of authentication because it was kind of frictionless to the user, right? You just walk in, you get recognized, and you can do what you want to do if you are in the right banking branch, obviously. But of course, the clerk couldn't know all customers, so they introduced a single-factor possession token, the savings book, to authenticate users in other branches as well. And that's interesting. This old one, you see the numbers, can't read them really, right? It's so old, everything, but it's a single-factor possession token, non-electronic, of course, that people used. But in addition to all the authentication and the recognition, we often also receive physical certificates to show various attributes of our identity. For example, educational achievements. And we all learn to keep those certificates very safe, right? Keep them in a safe place. And it is common practice for various entities to verify those. And we have rules what we verify. And when we produce those, we have also rules to make sure that the security standards for those certificates, especially the government ones, are met. And at least when it becomes really, really relevant, by default, we just trust them, right? So they look pretty if you just have a look at that, and we verify them if you really have to. And we really got sophisticated, right? We ask for utility bills in order to verify living addresses. For example, when applying for a real ID address, which is more functional now, not really pretty, and it's not really straightforward. No sealing box being used, which is great, and it's computer generated. But it's a kind of surprising effect that we are now misusing something like a utility bill, which includes information other than the one you really want to get out of there. It means the identity information here. And we also learn to present driver's licenses for proving our identity frequently, while we really rarely need them to prove our license to drive. And if you ask yourself, right, how often did you have to present your driver's license in the past 5 years? And now think about the number of events where you had to show them just to verify your ability to drive. You will typically be very surprised, right? It would really surprise me if that number would be higher than let's say 5% or so. So in some ways, a driver license serves a similar role as ID cards in other countries, just exposing more information and making it very obvious whether someone has a driver license or not. So we are somehow oversharing information. And as a result of that, we share many more data points than required, and the recipient needs to protect them properly. Here, another example, apartment rental. Now, they ask for income statements for stock portfolios, where in reality only guarantee potentially for a year's worth of rent is needed. Whoever is needed to, or whoever backed up one of their children to rent an apartment will likely have experienced that. And as a result, users feel uncomfortable sharing the data, and the recipient has a lot of problems, challenges to keep the data safe and risks data breaches, which is not nice as well. We often carry multiple third-party issued documents with us, like banking cards to access our banking accounts money when being offline, like ID cards in countries where we have to carry them, like in Germany, like driver's licenses in other countries or when we drive, like health insurance cards and more. Replacing them after loss is a really painful process and it's time-consuming. It typically requires physical presence at specific locations just to get to the security level which is required. It's sometimes easier to attack the original document itself. So when your German ID card was lost or stolen and you don't have a passport, you show your birth certificate. And this recovery process typically is easier to attack, but that because the birth certificate doesn't have any photograph on it, nor does it have as many security features as the ID card has, which opens the door for attacks. So we need to find a way to close that security gap in some way. We, in our modern world, are using computers and mobile devices very frequently. Standardized support for authentication, like FIDO passkeys, is still new, and standardized support for identity is mostly absent. Replacing a smartphone these days is painful. It's not mainly about the data. That is typically saved in the cloud. It's about the secrets that are not easily transferable. So recovery from a lost or stolen device is even more painful than the normal migration process, meaning if you still had access to the old device. First, you need a new SIM card. In the future, maybe the eSIM, but it still needs to be bound to your profile. And the basic security requirements remain. For non-banking apps, you will likely have to re-enter passwords and activate biometric authentication. But then for each banking app, you have to register the new app instance, at least in Europe. So if you have 3 different banking accounts, you will run through a full recovery process for 3 different banks completely independently, which is kind of too many things, right? Because in reality, you have to prove that you are the new owner of that device only once if you carry that over. And this is just because PSD2 SCA requirements doesn't allow a single password to be sufficient for that. So to sum that up, the current approach has evolved. It is not really fully consistent and it's very complex. It is surprisingly robust. So no scalable attacks exist in the physical world. And this is a very interesting observation. And that's something we really need to carry over in the electronic world, in the virtual world. So we need to focus on protecting against the targeted attacks in the physical world because physical presence doesn't scale. And somehow, with all this complication, we have learned to live with that. So that was the history. Now the question is, if we could work on a clean slate approach, how would we want the digital world to be? So how should our ePromiseland look like? And the full disclosure is, it would be great, but in practice, we can't have a clean slate approach, right? We have to live with all the legacy and that has impact. But nevertheless, it helps us to keep our clear goal in mind. And that's, I think, what we did in FIDO as well when we focus on the authentication. And where we ended up is a great stage already. So let's look at Francesca, our futuristic persona living in our ePromiseland. She could sign in to one of her 100 banks account without a password. And that happens 30 times a day on average, right? And the 100 bank accounts, or the 100 accounts, not bank accounts, 100 accounts is also an average. So that's just Francesca average in some way. So even more, with a minimum user burden, that means using her preferred modality, she could sign in. And this is nice, right? Because this somehow is respecting user preferences. And she can use her preferred form factor, like the platform authenticator or security key or the phone as a security key. And it works on all devices that are available on the market, which is great. This is exactly the ubiquity we dreamed of when we started FIDO in the first place, where no device supported that natively. And it works seamlessly on any device Francesca uses, which is another new thing which we got through the passkeys. It protects against the phishing which gives us the robust security in some way, right? Protecting against scalable attacks, which we always emphasize. It's so important because if you don't protect against those attacks, the attacker will just focus on the ones which scale, and then we really have a problem. And primarily relevant for regulated entities like PSD2 or NIST 863, it prevents duplication of personalized security credentials. So when you hear device-bound key or device public key, and I'm sure you have heard that this week already, right? This is a no duplication rule, which we want here in some way. And this is a way to get to that, even though we support these synchronizing credentials or keys across device boundaries to make it work on any device. And obviously, we want security evidence because the relying party wants to assess the security level in a robust way. Just seeing the key doesn't tell you how well the key is protected or not, whether if the key is publicly shared, even the private key could be publicly shared or not. So we want some security evidence, which in FIDO world we would typically call attestation. And so let's just assume we get that, and we have that, and we have defined that in FIDO, that it would roughly give us everything we need for the authentication. Now, we want to allow people to sign up without passwords to make that easy. So on any device Francesca owns, she could just sign up for a new account without having the need to remember the password, knowing that sign in later would work without the password as well. It's just seen. So this makes life so much more convenient for Francesca. And it also makes the internet so much more secure. This approach is supported for accounts without high security needs, like e-commerce accounts, electronic newspaper access, e-magazines, ride-sharing, all these things, as well as the ones with regulated security requirements, like mobile network operator accounts or financial institutions accounts, etc. We are on a good path to that future with the work in the FIDO Alliance and W3C. But there's more. Francesca, in our ePromiseland, can use a convenient and fully digital way of sharing claims or credentials when opening a new bank account. So just being asked, do you want to share your full identity claim for this user, Francesca Russo, with that specific bank to make it easy, right, to open that new bank account? I might have done that already in the past. Why do I have to provide a frequent and lengthy selfie and picture ID experience? So what we want is to support an open ecosystem of companies to issue such claims and get reimbursed when the claims are being shared. So we need some incentives for people to participate in that, while still shielding the relying party identity from the issuer to protect the user's privacy, which is another requirement we have. And without such incentive, why would someone want to become a claim issuer here? Right? Everyone would just want to consume those claims. And it still allows the regulated parties to understand who the claim issuer is and to what degree you might want to trust that and whether it meets regulatory needs or not. And of course, the needs differ by jurisdiction. A bank in the US, in the EU has to comply with different regulations, PSD2, and other anti-money laundering laws than a bank in the US or Nigeria. The framework of issuers and relying parties has sufficient governance rules in place to make all entities accountable in a similar way they are in the physical world today. And at the same time, still protects the user's privacy in a similar way as well. So we are on a good path with that, with Accountable Digital Identity Association and other initiatives we have seen. So this goes beyond just the recognition, the authentication, but it can reuse many building blocks we have seen and introduced so far, such as attestation for the security evidence, such as our protection mechanisms for phishing resistance, and also other detailed things like just the ability to access those APIs on the systems, regardless whether you are a web application or a native application on different devices. And of course, in ePromiseland, Francesca can easily restore all her passkeys to her new device, making it easy to change devices. The user burden relates to the maximum assurance level that the claim credentials require. So if I have my passport or ID card credentials on that, I will likely have to do something which is very comparable to the in-person check that I have to go through after I've lost a passport or an ID card today. And I think we want to have a similar way here to say, restore my credentials, and it's just asking me for the minimum burden I have to go through to restore all the credentials that I have, depending on the specific credentials I have and the specific region or jurisdiction I'm in, which gets us to other requirements, but still provides all the phishing resistance, the sync fabric security, and of course the evidence of that security is specific to that jurisdiction I'm in. So the method to restore phishing resistance, giving her peace of mind that the credentials can not be stolen, and it provides officials evidence to the relying party so that they know how well the credentials are protected and whether they meet the requirements, the legal requirements to being used the first time on a new device or subsequently. So this evidence even allows the relying party to understand whether the sync fabric is secure enough to meet specific regulatory needs, which means allowing banks to not do a step-up authentication the first time you use a new device. And one more comment on the pluggable sync fabrics that I think we want because of the different jurisdictions we have in the world. Some sync fabrics might be tightly integrated with the underlying platform. So taking ownership of the device itself might restore all the credentials. But some other sync fabrics might be on a separate platform and just verify username, password, OTP, which might be okay for some passkeys. And once over time, people store more valuable credentials in their sync fabric, they need to protect those as well. And as a result, sync fabrics might use document-centric ID proofing or the selfie and picture ID approach, but now it's single time per device and not once per account you have. And if you think about 100 accounts and maybe 5 banks under these 100 accounts, that will save a lot of time for them. So back to our persona, Francesca. Francesca has many very important passkeys and credentials stored in her sync fabric. So she selected a provider that meets her needs. Right? Like in Germany, it could look like this. She might want to use her national ID card before such sensitive credentials are being restored to a new device. And that provides a very robust protection against attacks, which is in line with all the regulations we have in Germany, and a similar approach you could do in other countries where you just plug in a different sync fabric for that. Practically speaking, she would just tap the card to her phone because this is already supported with our German national ID card. Francesca having peace of mind to be protected is one aspect. The other is that the relying parties accepting her credentials also have a need to understand the resulting assurance level. So not all sync fabrics will be the same, and regulations will depend on the different jurisdictions. So we need a way for the RP to understand the resulting assurance level of the credential, and that includes the security of the sync fabric and the ID verification for restoring it, and of course the security of the authenticator on the device as well. And Francesca can now use a convenient and fully digital way of sharing claims when applying for a new job. With employer changes every 4 years on average, this will make her life much easier. And Francesca can share more than just her core identity claims. Here she needs to share her work permit and educational degrees as well. The user requirements are the same compared to the open bank account use case. And we want a similar security level as well, so that security that we have to in our paper world, in the offline world, carries over to the online world, where we have to protect against the scalable attacks just in a different way. So instead of using sealing walks and other documents with signatures, we want the electronic equivalents that provide robust security. So we started that journey in 2011, formed the alliance and created specifications that resulted in an open interoperable ecosystem for convenient authentication. This is FIDO. And that's great that we are there. And there are many people which didn't believe that in the first place. We worked with Accountable Digital Identity Association, ADIA, on the version 1 specification for claim sharing. And there are other initiatives on that as well. We have just seen first implementations of multi-device credentials as we are getting along. So this is where we are now. But there's more work ahead of us. And we learned how that works. We want pluggable sync fabrics so users can select their preferred ones in the future. And that might also depend on the jurisdiction they are in. And we hear many relying parties are waiting for security evidence for the device public keys. So in FIDO, we call that attestation. It allows a relying party to know the security characteristics of a key. And we know that the industry also needs it for the sync fabric as a whole. When regulated industries shall be able to rely on those recovery methods without introducing their own methods on top of that. And that provides the foundation to leverage those sync fabrics also for restoring the claim credentials in addition to the passkeys to new devices, and very important usability aspect. Finally, and with many more detailed steps in between, we can then create an interoperable open ecosystem for sharing those claims and reach our ePromise, a convenient online world that provides robust security, a way to have fully digital processes without the need for sending paper documents when opening bank accounts, changing jobs, or renting new apartments. And I think we have created many of those building blocks we need over the line, over time already. We now have just to continue to plug those building blocks together and use them just beyond that initial authentication. So help us to continue on that path, right, to get to the other milestones I've laid out here and pull that together to really reach ePromiseland, which makes our internet more secure and more convenient. Thank you.